And reportedly, it was the battle axe that was the fiercest of these weapons, because the Vikings had tremendous skill in throwing these axes to, lop off people's heads or incapacitate them.
The monasteries along the coast particularly appealed to the Vikings because of their great accumulation of wealth and the passivity of the monks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun in the late 800s, is the primary source of English history from the 5th to the 11th century. It records the terror wrought by the Viking invaders. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. This attack on these monks and their treasures in 793 AD was an historical milestone, the first major Viking sea raid. But Lindisfarne and the other vulnerable monasteries along the coast of the British Isles were only the beginning. As the 8th century drew to a close, the Viking raiders set their sights on larger prizes. The major cities of Europe were about to feel the power and the fury of these Norsemen and the bite of their steel. The Vikings left Scandinavia to plunder. The 793 AD attack on Lindisfarne sparked an inferno of Viking barbarism that threatened to consume all of Europe. By the middle of the 9th century, only 50 years or so after Lindisfarne, word of Europe's removable wealth had spread. Norse families, villages, and whole communities banded together to build longships. They planned to improve their situation at the expense of those across the sea.
All the Spaniards later, when they came to America, they were looking for gold, but the Vikings were looking for silver, and silver was the great thing to them, and a lot of the religious implements, crosses, and the various things that one finds in a monastery were made out of silver.
The Viking factions headed out across the sea with no single ruler to unite them. Even when their fleets swelled to scores of ships, each still acted independently, making the onslaught all the more difficult to stop. As the reputations of individual Viking leaders began to grow, so too did their ambitions. Europe was theirs for the taking.
Europe is an odd continent in that it is crisscrossed by rivers that are all navigable. Unlike North America or Africa or some of the others, which only have a few very large rivers, Europe has many. So almost any large body of water that the Vikings could take their vessels down, remember they're narrow and they're long and they don't take a lot of water.
One of the first major river attacks came in 845 AD at the hands of a notorious Viking leader, Ragnar, a Dane. With a fleet of 120 ships, he seized upon the legacy of Lindisfarne with a vengeance, using the Seine to attack Paris. Before they got to the city, Ragnar's Vikings decimated the French advance force on the banks of the Seine, marching their French captives to a hideous end.
They were basically terrorists, and they relied on the terror to ease the way quite a lot. They didn't want to do any more work than they had to, so it'd be as awful as possible. There was a famous Viking who was known as the child lover because he would not throw babies into the air and spit them on his sword as they came down. I mean, these were not nice guys.
A local monk, Ermentarius, described the Viking onslaught and devastation that continued for decades along the Seine and Loire rivers. The number of ships grows. The endless stream of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere the Christians are the victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path, and nothing resists them.
When the large Viking fleet sails down the Seine River and proceeds on Paris, this huge town that is well defended, the king of France, who is residing in Paris, chooses instead of facing them and the possible destruction that could come from facing the Vikings, actually decides to buy them off.
The King of France, Charles the Bald, paid Ragnar nearly 6 tons of silver and gold bullion to get the raiders to leave and never come back. It had the opposite effect. As word spread that such loot could be had, that land and goods were everywhere, the pillage of northern Europe continued with a fervor. Between 790 and 1100 AD, Vikings followed every major river and water route into the heart of the continent. But for the Vikings, a new world awaited. Norwegians wrote perhaps the most colorful chapter in Viking history. As fearless explorers, they colonized Iceland and Greenland as they pushed further west. With this colonization came the story of 2 legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son Leif Erikson. In the late 900s, Eric became the first to settle this unforgiving land. A fiery character, Eric was soon banished for 3 years from Iceland as well. He sailed west and settled on the east coast of Greenland.
And so he begins to advertise this land, and he can't very well say, by the way, we only have a little bit of coastline that is at all habitable. So he goes over and says, we've got Greenland. It's covered in green. Some of them undoubtedly come, see what it is really like, and go home. But a lot of very strong and stalwart and hardy Vikings stay, and they have a life that is very harsh. The ground wasn't very tillable, but fishing was available, and other meat was available. But it was a harsh land.
During Eric the Red's leadership, a Norse agrarian society scratched a living in this distant land. For government, the villages convened at Althing, a kind of public assembly or court of law transplanted from their homelands. Here, free men had the right to speak in their defense and on issues of community concern. From this community of freemen came Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Like his father, he yearned to explore. In the year 1000, he set sail.
Leif Erikson follows a rumor. Another Viking before him has left an account that he was traveling to the west to go to the other colony in Greenland and gets blown off course. And by the time he has found his direction, he's off the coast of a very green and luscious land. Well, Greenland was not green, nor was it luscious.
This is a fascinating thing and still very, very controversial in a way. I personally believe that America was discovered by the Vikings in or about the year 1000. Leif Erikson's village in Newfoundland has been carbon dated, for example, precisely to the year 1000 AD. So we know that Vikings were at least in Newfoundland and probably farther to the south than that.
The Greenlanders' attempts to settle here failed. The Newfoundland colony lasted only a decade. But 500 years before Columbus made his epic journey, Vikings had linked the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland and introduced something new to the island settlers. With the same tools that built the longships, they built the rugged crosses of a new religion.
They decided that they would convert Leif Erikson went to Norway, where the king asked him specifically to take Christianity to Greenland and to Christianize Greenland colonies, which he dutifully did.
As Viking influence spread, the wider world in turn shaped Viking culture. Their leaders saw Christianity as a means to unite the clans, and ultimately to wield more control over them. At the dawn of the 11th century, 200 years after the attack at Lindisfarne, the Norse people still had no single king and little sense of solidarity. It was Christianity that presented a reason to unite.